Thank you so much. Hopefully this is working. So thrilled to be here. As he said, I'm Riddhiman Das. I am the CEO of Aligned, which is a new adventure for me. Before this, I was doing corporate venture capital for Ant Financial, which is the financial services arm of Alibaba. You might have heard about our big product in China called Alipay, and in India called Paytm. I've spent a ton of time in and around Southeast Asia, and I've seen a few things, learned a few things, and I'm excited to share some of those here with you. So what I'd like to speak about, and by the way, I originally had about 30 minutes, but we're running a little bit late, so I'll see if I can make up some time here. We'll see. I'll judge myself on that. So the theme of the talk is how to engineer win-win situations while emerging and investing in emerging markets. So an emerging market, often, it's growing, right? The hypothesis is that it's going to grow on this hockey stick curve of growth and lead to all this opportunity and empowerment by the local population. And I've had some personal experiences living through it. So before I was at Alibaba, I did a company called iVerify. What iVerify did was, it was in a place almost like Johor Bahru. It was out of Kansas City, Missouri in the United States. Nothing happens in Kansas City, Missouri, except occasionally you have the startup that tries to change the world, right? And what iVerify was doing was enabling people to verify their identity using the red blood vessels on the white part of the eye, and the reason why it was so transformational was that we didn't need any extra hardware. So it's the most accurate biometric you could do on a mobile phone without any extra hardware. So we raised money of all places from emerging markets. We were not funded by traditional VCs. We raised money from a major company in China, a couple companies in and out of Southeast Asia, and then we exited to Ant Financial, which led to this has a lag. So which led to rebranding of iVerify as Zolos, and then we joined the Ant Financial family. And through Ant Financial, that technology that we built, which had 3.5 million users in Western Europe and the United States, today has about 2 billion users in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in India, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Philippines, and Hong Kong, and obviously China. So having lived through it, there are things that you can do to make sure that everybody wins in this equation. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the information revolution that we're in the middle of. So we had what I call the first part of the information revolution, where physical data that existed in documents and stacks of paper got digitized and put into a computer, right? And I would like to think of it as what happened from this is what happened from the 1970s to about the 1990s. And while this is fantastic, it led for us to be able to use the computer to be able to analyze far more data and information than ever before. What it led to was still utilization of human judgment on this data, right? So you had human-readable, digitized documents, so-called data, and you applied human judgment on top of it, and you at what you wanted to do. Are we going to extend a mortgage? Are we going to give the guy a loan? Are we going to allow this person to be diagnosed over the internet? But that's increasingly a bygone era, because as we go to the next level of the information revolution, human judgment is being replaced by mostly machine judgment. And the internet is globally, as you can tell, internet world is pretty. I don't need to tell you anything. I don't have anything about this. But the internet is exploding in markets. And the theme is, there are two hypotheses here. One is, it is going to look a lot like the 30-year internet revolution that just happened in China or in India, possibly. And the other hypothesis is that it's going to look a lot like the the 40-plus year internet transformation that happened in the United States. So, and Western Europe. And as we dive deeper into that, it doesn't always, in my opinion, necessarily need to look like going towards one major internet superpower or the other major internet superpower. And the emerging market where the investments are being made have a role to play and can win in the process as well. So as I talked about the internet, the information revolution, the second part of the information revolution is where human judgment got replaced by mostly machine-aided human judgment, and now we have a mostly machine judgment. When you apply for a mortgage in the United States or in China, there's not a person looking at the mortgage application to try to decide whether or not you are a credit-worthy borrower. There is not a person on the other side trying to decide whether or not a particular credit card transaction is possibly fraudulent, or whether or not the source of funds that you put into your digital wallet are legitimate, right? That's happening automatically. And as we step into this world of computers and automated systems making decisions on our behalf, I'm afraid in some cases it's leading to this theme of surveillance capitalism, which is where human experience and the personal private experiences that we have are used as raw material for this next generation of digital products, right? And part of why surveillance capitalism does not always lead to a win-win situation is because once there exists a market where my personal experience dictates whether or not a particular company makes money, there is an incentive to modify my behavior. And just like the Industrial Revolution, surveillance capitalism can be very unkind to the resources that it consumes in the generation of this new value. The Industrial Revolution left in its wake climate crises and deforestation and all this other things that happen to the internet. And today, I believe that if the current trends continue, that similar devastation stands to happen to private human experiences. The original sin of the internet, as I like to think about it, is where during the dot-com crisis, or right before the dot-com crisis, we had these amazing companies that were powered by venture capital, and they had an unlimited amount of money to spend, and suddenly the dot-com boom happens. And as the dot-com boom happens, venture capitalists, investors, many of whom might have lived through it and are in this room, put a lot of pressure on their portfolio companies to start to make revenue. And for companies, this is an example of Google, you'll see one of the big differences between the screen on the left and the screen on the right is that there are ads, right? And that happened right around the time of the dot-com crisis, where the internet became perceivably a free good powered by advertisements. And that became the default business model for most of the big companies that exist to this day. I particularly like this quote by Jeff Hammerbacher, who's the co-founder of Cloudera, which is a big data company, who talked about the best minds of his generation spend their entire career trying to figure out how to make people click ads. And as you can tell, he's a pretty colorful person, and that really sucks, right? So today, powered by this surveillance capitalism and its tendency to cause, especially in emerging markets, data colonialism, you have essentially a tech Cold War, right? If any of you have read The Big Nine, you've got Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon on one side, and on the other side you've got the BATs, the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, and there's really a strong wall between the two. And today, the emerging markets are the battleground where these giants are fighting for dominance and control. I was one of them. I was trying to make, for my employer at the time, strategic investments that would lead to one of these 9 companies to be the winner in these emerging markets. I'm sure everyone else is trying to do the same. And there is, as we think about surveillance capitalism, one of the differences between old world, physical colonialism and digital colonialism here is that it is the opposite of 1984. I don't know if you've read a book called Jennifer's Government, right? So Jennifer's Government is the sort of the opposite theme of 1984, George Orwell. In 1984, the book, the governments have a lot of power. In Jennifer's Government, which is an excellent read if you haven't read it, the corporations have too much power. And if it just so happens that in emerging markets, some of these big 9 or some others from not the emerging market control all the data and the information and engage in surveillance capitalism by monetizing and using for profit the private human experience that we all undergo, it leads to a pretty Jennifer Government style of world. So that leads to digital colonialism, which we stand as one of the risks of not always letting the investments, if you will, in these emerging markets to add value to and capture and capitalize on the value that they're generating in that particular market. If all of the data goes to Google, or if all of the data goes to Facebook, or name your favorite tech giant in China, the nexus of power, of influence in the private human experiences, in the private financial experiences, and the private health experiences, and possibly all of these other industries that are getting disrupted by the internet and technology, the emerging market where the investment has been made or where the technology company is using technology powered by the big 9 does not always win. There is a second megatrend, which is, at least in the Western world, we've seen these big 9 have suffer leaks, suffer breaches, and they face they're losing trust in the consumer's mind. My grandmother cares about privacy today, which is, she didn't even know what that meant before Cambridge Analytica allowed, a particular president to come into power in my home country, or before Equifax was breached and all of our financial information ended up in an unencrypted S3 bucket, or before, the Edward Snowden revelations came on board. So I believe this trend is only going to grow and going to grow to China, to Malaysia, to Singapore, to Thailand, to Israel, to Eastern Europe. When I was doing corporate venture capital for one of the major big 9 companies, a question I often got is do you have privacy in China? And my standard answer was, which I still continue to believe, is that as an American, I have no more privacy than I do as a person operating within the Chinese internet sphere. What these Chinese big 3 companies and others know about me are the exact same things that the big 4 American companies know about me. In fact, more. I probably have shared much more information about my personal lives on Facebook and on my iPhone and on Google. And companies today face a trust crisis, right? So sorry that got cut out. I probably used a wrong display here, but this is Malaysia, right? And this is showing how people perceive the tech companies today. And their corporations, the internet corporations, are among the least trusted companies in the world today. In the United States, people trust Facebook as much as they trust big petroleum or big pharma, right? Which is which is not very much. And a third megatrend that got me particularly excited is that digital currencies increase the public trust in cryptography. For a long time, cryptography has existed since Julius Caesar. The Caesar cipher is the original cryptography that Caesar used while engaging in war and communicating, between different military units that were out and about in Europe. And it took until the advent of Bitcoin for the average person to understand what crypto means, what cryptography means, right? And I believe that is whether or not digital currencies or cryptocurrencies will go anywhere, this is a fundamental transformative moment in the industry. Once people trust their entire financial lives, which is starting to happen, in cryptocurrency, which is based on the belief that code is law and that what cryptography protects is rock solid and unchangeable and you can trust it, it changes the equation. It enables people to have another tool to take back control of their personal lives. And what happened as a consequence of just the cryptomania that we just lived through until 2018 or so is that it catalyzed the research across universities in the world and corporations around the world of new and interesting cryptographic primitives, which is essentially a set of mathematical theorems that enable you to act privately. And if you've known anything about cryptography so far, it's been applied to security for a good reason, right? You don't want the bad actors to necessarily take control of information that they don't need to have so that they can abuse my online accounts. But what I'm particularly excited about is the emergence of cryptography to foster privacy, which is to not let the custodian of my data abuse it or even have the potential to abuse it. So privacy is not security. Privacy is your rights as an individual to control your personal information and have a say in how it's used. It happens with prior informed revocable consent. What is done to your data, you should consent to. You should consent. The best kind of consent is cryptographic, where there is a key that mathematically ensures that I have no ability to abuse your data, even if I wanted to. One of the major big 9 companies has its motto as do no evil. I think what's better is can't do evil, which is what I believe privacy-oriented cryptography can get us to. So prior informed revocable consent. Revocability is very important. If said company is a custodian of my data and I want to revoke their rights to be able to do anything with my data, I ought to be able to do it. And if I'm able to do it mathematically, if I'm able to do it cryptographically, there is no potential for abuse. Obviously, security, on the other side, is how your information is protected. Right? You want your information to stay secure. You don't want it to fall into the hands of a nefarious bad actor. So there is, historically, as we have thought about cryptography, there hasn't necessarily been a distinction between privacy and security. And I believe the time to start to make that distinction is now, powered by some of these new cryptographic primitives that have emerged as a result of investments in digital currencies and cryptocurrencies. So math is greater than the law, right? In Western countries, oftentimes, they take pride in what they call the rule of law, right? The law is supreme, there is a constitution, and you have a strong working systems of courts that you can go for a recourse if a particular contract has been breached. But these contracts, if they're done in math, using cryptography, I believe that's a lot more powerful than relying on the legal system. But that leads to an ethical dilemma that I believe we'll have to resolve or have an opinion on as individuals, as corporations, as companies, as startups, which is, does a software developer determine what is law, right? Because today with smart contracts and with cryptographically enabled privacy policies, you don't need a privacy policy if you can just encode it using the right cryptography, But does that mean that a software developer or a product manager or a for-profit startup or big corporation should decide what the law should be? Should software developers be the people that protect our freedoms? And I don't necessarily have an answer for you today, but it's just something to start to think about, right? If we are going to have a win-win situation, do we rely on the legal system of the country where the particular company is operating, or do we rely on software developers and code to enforce that you can't be evil even if you had an intention to, or you wanted to, or you were not careful with how your data is stored? Which leads me to my fourth megatrend, which is governments are starting to regulate digital privacy. And I use the term digital privacy, not data privacy, because I believe privacy goes a lot more than just what you can do with the data. We've obviously seen GDPR emerge in Europe. We've seen the California Consumer Privacy Act, which came into effect January 1st. If you have any accounts with American-based companies, the California Consumer Privacy Act is essentially the version of GDPR for the United States. India in 2017, the Supreme Court passed a resolution that said that digital privacy is an unalienable right of every Indian citizen, right? Akin to the right to free speech or the right to freedom of religion. And a lot of these are catalyzing a new set of ways of thinking about how and where your digital information and the operations done on it, the algorithms done on it, are stored. So the regulatory concerns that I believe governments can and ought to control today are around the data and the algorithms. First, starting with data localization. I know as I was working in these emerging markets, especially Southeast Asia, I'm familiar with a particular Southeast Asian country that decided to implement Indian-style national identity database. And for that national identity biometric database, they had face and eyes and 10 fingerprints of both of your fingers. They decided to store the data on Amazon Web Services, AWS. And that's all well and good. You get the benefits of the cloud and all of that. But that particular data center was not in the country that implemented this national ID scheme. And so it was not subject necessarily to all of the rules and regulations that govern the safeguarding of that data and the appropriate security policies and legal policies around it. So data localization and making sure that the individual whose data it is and not the custodian of the data where it sits are major things that the regulators in these emerging markets ought to have in place to engineer a win-win situation between startups and their investors that may be one of the big nines or someone not from that emerging market. Portability is also very important. Let's say today I use a Google-powered mobile app to do payments, and tomorrow I decide to use a Tencent-powered mobile app to do payments. Should my data be able to move from the Google-powered app, if I wanted to move to the Tencent-powered app, to some other competitor that comes locally and decides to offer a mobile payment service? And portability is something that historically has gotten a lot less attention. And as the antitrust discussion starts to boil up in the United States, this is going to be a major concern. And revocability. If I have particular data with custodian A or custodian B that's possibly backed by a particular big company out of the Western world or the Eastern world, I should be able to revoke their consent to my data. And ultimately, the right to be forgotten. And the right to be forgotten is very important and very challenging. It is easy to say that if someone has some data on me, that they ought to be able to delete it. Okay, great. That achieves 25% of the outcome. But the major outcome is corporations today will take that data and engineer models on top of it. My data does not exist just in the form of plain text or cryptographically encrypted data, but it exists as part of a model that may have been used to train, let's say, a fraud detection model. If I use a particular mobile wallet in this country, and that data of my spending history has been used to train and improve the fraud model of that particular mobile wallet, how do you delete data from a trained object, from a trained model, right? And these fraud models are getting really, really, really good. You can tell that the countries that have a lot of data and a lot of users outperform the countries where there's not as many users. Every Chinese fraud detection model is 100 times better than any American fraud detection model. And the fifth megatrend is the rise of the freelance economy that I don't think companies and startups have figured out how to leverage to the fullest extent. According to Upwork statistics, the majority of workers worldwide will be freelancers by 2027. And these freelancers have computer science degrees, have advanced engineering degrees, and more value can and will be generated outside the traditional boundaries of the firm. And this gets me excited because as much as there's cryptographic tools and the mathematical tools to be able to license data in a private way from one way to the other, there isn't a cryptographic way, there hasn't been a cryptographic way to license intellectual property that is code or algorithms from one entity to the other. So what hasn't changed despite all of this is that all companies, yesterday and today, build their own algorithms on their own data. They hold on to human readable data, and that's a bad thing, as we've seen what happened with Capital One, what happened with Equifax. Revoking consent to that data is ambiguous, doesn't often happen, and portability. If I've been on Netflix for 10 years and I want to now move to Amazon Prime Video, it's hard. How do I make sure that Amazon Prime Video recommendations are up to par with my Netflix recommendations when that data is arguably mine, not Netflix's? Thank you.